Hi everybody, welcome to week 11. This week we're going to be talking about pop art and minimalism, which are the movements from the 1960s that follow abstract expressionism. Um, I think a good way to really introduce the topics for this week, is to recognize that now that we're about 90 years into modernism, we're starting to see more and more how modernism responds to earlier movements to the point where it becomes so conscious of itself that it starts to distance itself from its original values. This period, this moment around 1960 when pop art and minimalism emerges, is what philosophers and historians often call the beginning of postmodernism. And that really means that society has reached a point where its values have changed to the degree that perhaps it's best defined as a new historical epic. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute when I introduce the slide lectures. But before I do, I just want to do some housekeeping as I normally do and look at what's required this week. So we're going to be reading the abstract expressionism, the pop art and minimalism chapters in Gompertz. There are also a couple of online readings that are short, that are excerpted from artists' writings, Donald Judd, Klaus Oldenburg, and Jasper Johns. There's also a very short film where artist Robert Rauschenberg talks about his interest in erasing a drawing done by an abstract expressionist artist, Wilhelm de Kooning. There's also a journal entry this week, as well as a quiz. Okay, so I want to talk briefly about pop art and minimalism. But in order to augment the slide lectures, I think it's important to recognize that there's a really important philosophical shift going on in the arts. A philosophical shift that reflects wider, large social shifts that we could also call philosophical shifts in the way people think about what it means to be alive, what the values of a society are at a particular time period. I've stopped the video here at Andy Warhol's tomato soup can from 1962. I thought it was an artwork that you might be familiar with, along with some of Warhol's other work. And I think it's really a great example. It's really indicative of the pop art movement. Now, your journal challenge this week is to talk about the way that pop art and abstract expressionism are different. And I think that should be pretty clear to you once you listen to the lectures. But I think just by looking at this image, we can see how far this is from, say, Pollock's interest in Jungian psychology and the unconscious, and the way that the artists of the abstract expressionist movement are extremely interested in the human condition, right? The way that artists as humanists try to comment on what it means to be alive, and how people live their lives. If we look at this Warhol, it appears that artists have stopped thinking about those deep philosophical questions and have started looking toward the popular culture that they are absorbed within. And that's exactly what happens. So a good way to put this, and I hope this is helpful to you, is that if artists and philosophers were interested in the period of modernism in preserving humanistic inquiry by creating artistic expression that's meant to elevate and touch the most sensitive core of human experience. What seems to happen around 1960, and of course, things don't happen overnight. So it's in this sort of in the 50s into the 60s. What seems to happen is that artists are no longer confident. They no longer believe that we can live outside of the commercial consumerist society, where artists prior to the 1960s thought that art served as a contrast, right? It was constantly trying to be a bulwark, a defense against popular culture. But by the time we get to the 60s, both artists and philosophers start to believe that pop culture and mass communications, mass consumption is so prevalent in society that it would be impossible for artists to step outside it. And this is why we get these kinds of expressions. Now, the minimalists have a different take on this, right? They also are suspicious of the abstract expressionists' interest in spirituality, in psychology, in this idea that art can somehow touch the soul, let's say. However, they take more of a point of view where, actually, let me switch. Let me just go down to this one. They take a point of view where they're much more interested in industrial materials, in a kind of starkness and repetition that we often see in urban environments, in the city, in industrial parts of the city. Yet at the same time, there's something simple and poetic about this work. So I would argue that the minimalists are somewhat in touch with the kinds of the interest in sort of an elevated idea of inquiry, a little bit closer to the abstract expressionists. However, they want to keep a very cool distance toward it. And I'm not surprised if you look at this work, Carl Andre, especially his, hold on, let me get back here. This one, the one made out of fire bricks, equivalent 8, and really say to yourself, how on earth is this art? I could go to any hardware store, buy a bunch of bricks, and put them on the floor. And I can assure you the public reacted to this piece that way. But I think that when you really start to understand where these artists were coming from, you start to recognize that what they're really trying to do is think about the way that the body interacts with these pieces, in the way that you have to walk over, say, this Carl Andre piece, or the way your body is potentially reflected in these shiny steel panels. So that's a real shift in the philosophy behind this work. It's at once quiet and poetic, and on the other hand, extremely banal and industrial and commonplace. And perhaps that's a way of looking at what modern life feels like in the 1960s. So we have these two movements. We have one exemplified by Andy Warhol, where the idea is if you can't get outside of pop culture, then if we're controlled by it, if we're driven by it and motivated by it, then let's put it out there. And another one that says, we are so deep into kind of our industrial, repetitive, boring existences that what if we sort of took that as a cue toward making art? So keep those things in mind, and keep in mind how different these ideas are philosophically from abstract expressionism. Okie doke. I have returned your midterms and posted midterm grades. I'm having trouble figuring out how to let you see the comments that I put on your midterms. So I'm going to be speaking with Blackboard support on Monday about that, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can on that. And I think the issues with why the quizzes were not posting is finally resolved. I hope so. And that should do it for this week. As always, if you have any questions, shoot me an email. And if you're celebrating a holiday this weekend, I hope you enjoy it. And I'll be available for your questions and look forward to recording the next screencast next week. Okay, take care, everybody.